It's a very warm welcome to Africa 360. We bring you news and views with a distinctly African perspective. I'm Chris Marilang and welcome to this special election edition of Africa 360. South Africans head to the voting booth this week. It's also a special occasion as the country also celebrates 20 years since the first democratic elections in 1994. But the stakes have certainly changed. South Africans have much to consider as they cast their vote. And this week's episode of Africa 360 breaks down the politics, economics, and the choices that lay ahead for the electorate. So voters have been bombarded by campaigning in the last few months, from public debates to billboards and SMSs and social media campaigns. Every one of the nearly 30 parties that are vying for attention of the voters in this election. But does a catchy slogan guarantee an efficient administration? Take a look.
In recent years, widespread protest action has grabbed the headlines in South Africa. Some townships went up in flames as residents expressed their anger at what they call government's poor service delivery. Bekkersdal, Motutlung, and Bronkhorstspruit were some of the hotspots.
We've gone 3 weeks without electricity.
We want the municipality to tell us what is the problem about the sewage system of this township.
There have been a total of 48 service delivery protests since the beginning of this year alone. Despite the 20-year review released by President Jacob Zuma recently that tried to paint a positive picture of improving living standards for the poor.
When 95% of the households have access to water, the 5% who still need to be provided for feel they cannot wait a moment longer. Success is also the breeding ground of rising expectations.
Another factor driving demonstrations, which often turn violent, is widespread corruption. At the local government level, this hampers effective service delivery. Over the past 5 years, many municipal officials have been arrested countrywide, charged with crimes ranging from financial mismanagement to tender fraud. With elections around the corner, opposition parties are having a field day. They blame the ruling ANC for the upsurge in protests and accuse the government of increasing corruption. Even President Jacob Zuma is in their sights as the Nkandla corruption scandal hangs over his head.
More of your money pays. It pays these ministers and deputy ministers instead of being used for you. We want to reduce that size of government.
There are millions of people unemployed in our country, and they are seeing hundreds of millions of rands spent on the private palace of one person.
Like you, we saw a leadership installed under the cloud of criminal suspicion and personal scandal at the highest level. We have seen corruption take hold at every level of government.
As elections approach, many opposition parties are promising to tackle the scourge of corruption head-on should they be elected. This may just have struck the right note with the electorate, but it remains to be seen whether this will swing the vote come the 7th of May.
Joining us here in studio now is Marie Harris from the global market research company IPSOS and political analyst Professor Sipho Seepe. Let me start with you, Marie. It must be a very difficult market space for the voter, for the electorate. How are you reading it? What are the polls that you're reading before we go into this election indicating who's going to win?
I think the ANC will be between 62 and 64%, which is lower than what they want to be. Mm-hmm. It's also lower than what they were last time. And the DA is going to be somewhere between 20 and 23%. The EFF coming in third between 5 and 6.5.
Interesting statistics, but it seems to also go against some of the other data that you have collected. And here also, you had this very interesting national satisfaction statistics around the perception of governance. Very low figures. In actual fact, when we look back at similar periods from 2009 coming to 2013, what we note here is that the perception of government in general is under 50%.
Yes.
Less than 50% of the people are satisfied with government. So why would they vote so highly for the ANC?
Because all the people are not voting. There are about 36 million South Africans who are eligible to vote, who are 18 years and older, and only 25 million of them are registered. So 11 million of them, or of us rather, are saying we are not even registering to vote, let alone speak about it. Then, about of the 25 million that are registered, we cannot say all of them will vote. Last time in 2009, 77.4% voted of the registered voters. If that happens, it will be around 18, 19 million. So a further 6 million will not vote. So we're already at about 17 million people who will not vote, who are about the same as those who are voting. So half of the people who are eligible to vote actually, in the end, vote.
This is an interesting statistic, and it's a good place to bring in Prof. Sipho here. Why is it that people don't perceive the polls or elections as a legitimate way of expressing their discontent around their perceptions on governance, bad economy, as we see from these statistics?
Historically, what we have always done is that whenever we are unhappy, we go to the streets. And in a sense, we fail to say to them, translate that protest into something tangible, where the person who's going to represent you might be somebody different. But here's also the challenge. The challenge that we also have is that you often find that even the people who are protesting are also members of the ruling party. So effectively, what it does, it makes it almost difficult. People begin to say, but what does a vote give me?
Let's take a moment to hear what the politicians are promising and listen to their manifestos in a nutshell.
What I'm known for is service delivery. What I'm known for is good governance. What I'm known for is transparency and accountability. That is what we offer people of this country.
Surely transparency in all tender procedures is a very important one. And the whole idea of civil servants that can tender for state contracts is a big problem. You ought to stop that immediately, make it transparent, and hopefully we can see then that we can start fighting corruption.
We are going to ensure that a tendering system is eradicated as a way of fighting corruption.
Our priorities during this term shall remain the creation of more jobs, decent work and sustainable livelihoods, and the fight against crime and corruption.
Promises, promises, promises there from the opposition and indeed the incumbent, the ruling party. What do you think about these promises? Do they make sense to the electorate?
Well, they do make sense to the electorate, but what they are also looking at is how is the ruling party reacting to this? And what they see is that the ruling party seems to be making encouraging noises. And it's a question of who can you trust.
So, Marie, why then haven't the electorate paid heed to a lot of this discourse that is coming from the opposition parties? Isn't there resonance with the majority of people to what they're saying?
I do not think so. I think there is, for a lot of people, just no alternative at the moment. And a lot of people will vote ANC because they have always voted ANC. That is, it's a historical thing. Is that, you know, there are voters who will change their vote, obviously, because I do believe the ANC will get slightly less than the last time. But in a lot of cases, people in this country are not voting on manifestos. They're not voting for leaders. They are voting with their blood and guts.
Blood and guts and ethnicities and race, some of the key factors that influence the manner in which the political parties have been trying to garner the vote. Do join us after the break as we continue our conversation and look at how economic decisions influence the way that people vote in these upcoming elections for South Africa.
I do not think the electorate necessarily understands the economy. They also don't need to, because people buy bread and milk.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, this is the special election edition of Africa 360. This is as South Africans head to the polls. Voters are sure to consider their pockets, while citizens grapple with bread and butter issues nationally. The country is still struggling to find a strategy for economic transformation. But high unemployment and a worrying rate of joblessness among South Africans has only widened the deep division left by the legacy of apartheid.
"20 years ago, the vote meant freedom. But South Africans soon learned that political freedom did not necessarily bring economic freedom. Despite an aggressive program of black economic empowerment, true transformation has been slow. While the public service has certainly changed, the private sector has been criticized for a crawling changeover. Still, having a job at any skill level is still an opportunity few can afford to lose. The nearly 1 in 4 jobless South Africans have had little opportunity to enjoy the fruits of freedom. And with at least half of the country's young people unemployed, the next generation is perched on a tipping point.
Thank you very much, comrades.
President Jacob Zuma has promised radical economic transformation over the next 5 years.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
The incumbent candidate has promised 6 million new jobs, a tall order that the ANC is already struggling to fulfill. The ruling party can't be blamed for not trying. The Mandela era had the Reconstruction and Development Program, or RDP. That was scrapped for a more free market approach under the Growth, Employment and Redistribution, or GEAR policy of the Mbeki years. The Zuma years are marked by the National Development Plan, an innovative all-encompassing policy that will solve many of South Africa's social and economic ills. That's if stakeholders finally agree to implement the policy. Parties vying for votes have placed the economy front and center of their manifestos. The main opposition party is pushing entrepreneurship, while leftist parties like the aptly named Economic Freedom Fighters are pushing for radical economic change. But how will a contracting economy pay for controversial policies such as free services and land redistribution and still compete in a global economy?
Marie, let me start with you. The interesting thing, as Bill Clinton famously commented when he said, "It's the economy, stupid," and that really factors heavily in the minds of a lot of the electorate in more developed countries. Here in South Africa, after you told me that you anticipate that the ANC is probably going to walk away with 60%, a little bit more than that, why do you think they're still going to vote for the ANC when we look at some of the statistics that you've presented here indicate that high rates of unemployment, inflation, the income gap, and what they perceive as bad management of the economy? Why wouldn't that weigh heavily on the mind of the electorate now?
When we asked people the last time what are the biggest issues in the country, almost 90% mentioned unemployment.
Yes.
And if you then, well, there's a load of other issues as well mentioned. And then you say to them, now choose one, only one thing that you want the government to address. Half of them say unemployment. So that is definitely the biggest thing the government needs to do something about.
Even though we are seeing the unemployment rate very low, one of the things that we do note is that there has been this global economic downturn. We have seen limited amounts of foreign direct investment into South Africa. And indeed, when you look at the economy generally, it's been impacted by external factors in the main. Then do the electorate understand this? Is that probably why they are still continuing to support the ANC?
I do not think the electorate necessarily understands the economy. They also don't need to. Because people buy bread and milk. And they do understand that their bread and milk and food becomes more and more expensive. They do understand the inflation. You don't need to go into the detail to explain to them. They can see that the bond they pay for their house or their car, or whatever they have, is going up. So they do understand about interest rates. So in a different way, in a practical way.
This is interesting. Do the parties vying for government have solutions, or are they just being negative?
We are not going to tolerate 5 million young people walking in our streets. Every one of them will be given a second chance to create the skilled labor force we need. The money will come from the SETAs. We will abolish the SETAs.
The money from the mines and all strategic sectors in the economy must not go to individuals. It must go to the communities and the workers.
We will create access to capital, for example, via development banks that assist sector-specific entrepreneurs.
And let me make it quite clear. These 7 million EPWP opportunities are over and above the 6 million real and permanent jobs that businesses will create in a growing economy under a DA government.
Well, we've heard what the political parties are promising in terms of economic policy. But my question to you is, do they have their pulse on the heartbeat of the people? Do their economic choices and policies make sense to the electorate?
Well, if you take the issue of the DA, which is the main political opposition party, they talk about 6 million jobs. Everybody in this country wants to hear that. But they are not consistent. 1 minute they are confused about whether they support affirmative action, black economic empowerment. You know that the majority of the people in this country still have a sense that they are poor because of that history. And when you show that confusion, you are not being consistent. So you can talk about 6 million jobs, but you say, but what about the history?
So when you look at the economic policy itself that is being spoken about, it does appear that it doesn't seem to be realistic in the minds of the electorate, given your projections?
I think most of the economic policies of all the parties are very much the same thing. Same old, same old. Talk about 6 million job opportunities. What does that mean? Nobody explains that. Nobody goes and says, this is what we will do to create those things. So you cannot blame the electorate for saying they do not understand the economic messages of the political parties, and all of them do that.
Doing your research well, knowing where to campaign does bring some of that electorate out. Do join us after the break as we look into how accessing the youth vote may affect the outcome of these elections. Stay tuned to Africa 360.
We have become normal as a society in the sense that we now take democracy for granted.
This is Africa 360, and we're talking elections, specifically the elections in South Africa. Just over a third of South Africans born after 1994 have registered. And remember, that's a third. And the majority of the registered voters are over the age of 30. So, will traditional voting patterns prevail? Well, joining us to help us unpack this in studio is Professor Sipho and Marie Harris from the global market research company IPSOS. Once again, thank you for joining us. Interesting statistics there, Marie. We're seeing, less than 2/3 of the born-frees coming out and registering, which basically gives us a sense of who will turn out to the polls. Tell us a little bit about this, the impact.
Yeah, it is actually a failed campaign from the IEC. They tried very hard to get the born-frees to register. But in the end, I do not believe that campaign was completely on message, because you need to convince young people to register to vote, and you need to tell them what's in it for them. Why register?
But
I'll turn it
around on you here, Marie, and say maybe it is the failure of opposition parties to go out there and get these guys to register. Because if I was an opposition party, I would have said maybe I should go out and get these guys to register.
I think it's the failure of everybody in politics. I wouldn't say it is only the failure of the opposition parties. And secondly, I also feel it's a failure of the generation that we have of adults.
Yeah.
It's not only the parties, because the adults think so little of this democracy that they didn't inspire their children to go and register to vote. I really think that's a failure on the side of parents as well, and not only the others.
There's also a slightly, deeper issue here, Professor Seepe, which is that questions the issue of civic virtue, I would argue. What's happened to the civic virtue? What's happened to those masses that we saw as we look in nostalgia to the first elections, 1994? Why are we not engaged with politics anymore?
Well, I think on one end we have become normal as a society, in the sense that we now take democracy for granted, and part of it also has to be blamed on the ANC. There is nothing that prevented the ANC government for 20 years to remind the young people in schooling, in education, how we got this democracy.
But this is interesting, because we get someone who is seen as an icon of our liberation struggle in the form of Ronnie Kasrils, former minister in the ANC government, who has now embarked on this campaign to say people should basically spoil their votes, vote no. Does this help in bringing credibility and value to the notion of the vote?
In the absence of education, I think that campaign for me is irresponsible. And if you're so unhappy with the ANC, when you ask people to spoil a vote, you're actually strengthening the ANC. Because if I'm unhappy with the ANC, I would expect you that you'd encourage me to vote for another party. Because once I vote for another party, the ANC not loses me, but another party gains. But at the moment, it seems a loss from the ANC. But it does not, the pain is not felt. But I do think that the best way in which the stalwarts like those can play is to read the manifestos and tell people what the implications are, so that when they vote wisely. But to simply sulk, to say I'm unhappy, therefore I do nothing, I'm going to spoil. That is not what we should be teaching the young people.
But on the other hand, Marie, it has been said that one of the most patriotic things that you can do is to dissent. And this form of dissent that is being advocated by people like Minister Kasrils might have some resonance maybe with the youth themselves. They might not articulate it, but aren't they basically saying the same thing by not bothering to register?
I think they might be saying the same thing by not bothering to register. But we must also remember that it really takes a political leader with a lot of clout to inspire the youth to go and register or to vote, like Barack Obama did in his first election. He really inspired young people to vote. And it's a natural tendency that there are less young people in the world voting than older people. That's just how it works.
And this is the very next point when we talk about the youth vote, the leadership of the various parties. Do the youth, particularly those who haven't bothered to vote really see inspiration in any of the leaders of the political parties?
Well, I think Marie is correct that if you take what Obama did, that was exemplary.
Yeah.
To take people, young people who are disinterested and bring a mass, almost what became a tsunami of young people in the history of the United States, universities, so inspired. But that requires work. Yeah. It does not require you to spring out just before elections and say people should not vote. That is not inspirational. That actually is not even educative. What is most educational is to make them understand the value of a vote and also to make them understand that they can change their circumstances by doing things differently and suggesting possibilities. This one is the easiest and the laziest campaign.
Yes, easy and lazy campaigns, less likely, in my view, to bring about the kind of turnout that we're looking at, particularly as South Africa marks 20 years of democracy. So, when you make your mark, what influences your vote? Will you even vote? Or are we, the media, simply putting too much emphasis on a very ordinary feature of democracy? Do tell us what your views are via Facebook or Twitter, at Africa360_eNCA, or send us an email at Africa360@enca.com. So until next time, when we look forward to bringing you Africa like you've never seen it before, do take care. Thank you so much.